The cream hit the guard's face before I understood what I was seeing. A fat pastry crushed flat against his cheek, so the filling burst out under his chin strap and slid down the polished line of his jaw. The man who threw it was already laughing, already turning his phone around to catch his own grin in the same frame, and the guard did not move. Not his eyes, not the rifle held at the shoulder, not the smallest muscle of the cheek that now wore a yellow smear like an insult someone had painted there. I had a tray of warm rolls balanced on my forearm, and I stood frozen on the cobbles outside my own shop front, 20 feet from the gate, watching a stranger ruin a thing I had admired every morning for 9 years. My name is Tomas Hale, and I bake bread. My shop sits across the lane from the east railings of the Aldermere Palace gate, close enough that I have watched these guards stand their 2-hour reliefs through summer heat that softened the road and through winter mornings when frost grew on the brass of their buttons. I knew this one by his bearing before I ever learned anything else about him. He was tall and very still, and he held the line of his post the way other men hold their breath, as if letting go even an inch would cost him something he was not willing to spend. So when the cream pastry came apart against his face, it landed on me too, in a way. I had sold that pastry. I want that on the record from the first sentence, because it is the part I have carried longest. The man who threw it had bought it from my counter 4 minutes earlier, a custard horn dusted with sugar, and he had filmed himself buying it, narrating to his phone the whole time in that bright, breathless voice that men like him use when they have decided the world is a stage built only for them. "We're gonna test him," he'd said to the little glass eye of the camera while I bagged his order. "We're gonna find out if these guys are even real." I should have said something then. I have told myself that 100 times. But I am a baker, not a brave man, and I handed him his change and watched him walk out into the bright morning toward the railings with his phone held high, and I followed only because I wanted my pastry not to be part of whatever he was about to do. I was too late by the length of a laugh. The guard stood at the inner edge of the worn stone, behind the low decorative railing that keeps the public at a respectful distance, in the spot where the guards of the east door have stood for longer than the railing itself has existed. Tourists were gathered loosely around, the way they always are, a dozen phones already up out of simple curiosity. And the vlogger, this loud, bright man in an expensive jacket, had walked straight up to the railing, leaned over it as far as his belt would let him, and pushed the custard horn into the guard's face the way a child pushes cake at another child, except there was nothing childish in it. There was calculation. He had aimed for the camera angle. I saw him check it. He didn't even blink. The man crowed, delighted, dancing back a half step with the phone swinging to catch the smear, the crowd, his own face. "You're seeing this live. He can't do anything. That's the whole bit, that's the whole, he literally cannot react." The guard's eyes stayed forward, past the man, past the railing, past the lane and my shop and me standing in my doorway with my tray, as though he were looking at something none of us could see, something a long way off that mattered more than custard. And the crowd laughed. That is the thing I want to be honest about. Some of them laughed. Not all, but enough that the sound carried, and the vlogger fed on it the way a fire feeds on dry kindling, growing louder, bolder, leaning back over the railing with a fresh idea blooming on his face. Okay, round 2, he announced. "We're gonna see how far this goes." I set my tray down on the bench outside my window. I did not decide to do it. My hands simply did it, because something in me had begun to understand that I was not watching a prank. I was watching a man assault another man who had taken an oath not to defend himself, and filming it and calling it entertainment. The cream was sliding off the guard's jaw now and dripping onto the dark wool of his tunic, one slow bead at a time, and the guard let it. He let it because the alternative, breaking his post, swinging at a man, becoming the spectacle the vlogger so badly wanted, was a defeat dressed up as a victory, and he was not a man who confused the two. I know that now. In the moment I only knew that my chest had gone tight, and that I had stopped being a bystander somewhere between the counter and the curb. "Sir," I said, my voice came out smaller than I wanted. "Sir, that's enough." The vlogger turned, and I got my first full look at his face, young, handsome in the over-groomed way of men who study their own reflection for a living, eyes lit with the specific hunger of someone who measures his life in numbers that go up. He looked at me, at my flour-dusted apron, at my soft hands and my soft middle, and he laughed again, and he turned the camera on me. "We got a hero, folks. The bread man wants to save the soldier." He swung back to the guard, energized. "Relax, Grandpa, it's just cream. He thinks it's real. They all think it's real." He pulled a second pastry from his jacket pocket. He had bought two. I remembered with a lurch ringing up two. "Don't," I said. He did. The second one he threw, hard, from a half-step back, an underhand toss that caught the guard just below the eye. And this time the impact rocked the man's head a fraction of an inch, the way a slap rocks a head, and a streak of red showed at the corner of his eyebrow where the hard edge of the pastry's sugar crust had split the skin. Not much, a thread of it, but it was there, and the crowd's laughter cut off as cleanly as if someone had closed a door. The guard did not raise a hand to his face. He did not touch the cut. He stood and bled the smallest amount, and looked at the far thing only he could see, and I watched the vlogger's grin falter for the first time as the silence reached him and told him something his numbers never had. "It's okay, that's still part of it," he said, but the brightness had thinned. He glanced at his phone screen at the live count of whoever was watching and steadied himself on it the way a drunk steadies himself on a wall. "He's fine. Look at him. He's a statue. Statues don't bleed, am I right?" Nobody laughed. And in that quiet, with the cream on his tunic and the thin red line above his eye, the guard's discipline stopped looking like helplessness to me and started looking like the strongest thing on that whole bright street. He was the only person there who was not afraid of what came next. I did not know yet that the next 2 minutes would end this man's entire life as he had built it. I did not know that the same phone he held up to capture his triumph was, at that very moment, recording the one piece of evidence that would take everything from him. I only knew that the gate behind the guard had begun, very quietly, to open. A second guardsman stepped out from the shadow of the arch. He came at the slow, measured march these men use, heel and toe, no hurry in it and no doubt, and he took up a position a pace behind the first, eyes forward, hands at the rifle. He did not look at the vlogger. He did not look at the cream or the cut. He simply arrived, and his arrival changed the air on that street the way a cloud changes a field all at once, without a sound. The vlogger felt it. I watched him feel it. His shoulders climbed toward his ears and his voice climbed with them, brighter and faster, the way a man talks when he has begun to suspect he has made a mistake and is trying to outrun the suspicion. "Two of them now. Okay, this is content, this is gold, you're all witnessing history." He swung the phone in a wide arc to take in both guards, the crowd, the gate, his own face, narrating over the top of it all. "They still can't touch me. That's the rule. They literally are not allowed. I could stand here all day." "You can't actually," said a new voice, even and unbothered, and a third man stepped through the gate. He was older. He wore a darker coat with more weight on the shoulders of it, and a band of insignia at the cuff that meant nothing to me then and everything to me now. He did not march. He walked, the way a man walks through his own house, and he came to the railing and stood beside the two guards and looked at the vlogger with an expression of such complete, unhurried calm that the loud man actually took a step back. "Sir," the older man said, "you've assaulted a sentry on duty. Twice, on camera." I put the phone down. "Assaulted," the vlogger laughed, but it was a different laugh now, a high, uncertain thing. "It's cream. It's a joke. He's a public figure, he's standing in public, this is satire, this is." "He's a serving soldier at his post," the older man said, "and you've drawn blood, the cream is the least of it." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Keep filming if you like, it's all admissible. I have replayed that moment so many times. The way the word admissible landed, soft as a fingertip, and how the vlogger's hand, the one holding the phone, gave the smallest jerk, as if some animal part of him wanted to throw the device into the river and could not, because the device was the whole point. The device was his life. And even now, even here, he could not bring himself to stop recording. That was the trap he had built for himself. He had spent years training his own hands never to lower the camera, and the habit held even as it hanged him. "You don't get to talk to me like that," the vlogger said, and the bright performer's voice was peeling away now, showing something thinner and meaner underneath. "Do you know how many people follow me? Do you know what one video does? I'll have your job. I'll have all your jobs. I'll post your face, and you'll be the most hated man in this country by lunch." The older man looked at him for a long moment. "I imagine you might try," he said. "Meanwhile, that soldier is bleeding and you are still here." He turned his head a fraction, not even fully toward the gate, and said, in the same level tone, "Send for the constables, and ask them to bring someone from the unit's legal section. We'll want this done properly." A young guardsman inside the arch moved at once and was gone. The word constables went through the crowd like cold water. I felt the mood turn under my feet. The ones who had laughed a minute ago were suddenly very interested in their own shoes, or were quietly stepping back, or, and this is the part the vlogger never understood, were lifting their own phones, all of them now, but not to celebrate him, to document him. The hunter had become the hunted, and he was the last to know. "This is harassment," the vlogger said, louder, spinning to address the crowd, to address his unseen audience, to address anyone. "You're all witnesses, they're threatening me there." He thrust the phone toward the older man's face. Say your name for the camera. Let's see how brave you are when." "Step back from the railing," said the first guard. It was the first thing he had said. The whole time, through both pastries, through the cut above his eye, he had not spoken one word, and now 4 came out of him flat and quiet and absolutely without heat, and they stopped the vlogger's mouth more completely than a shout ever could have. The man who had been narrating his own life nonstop for years simply ran out of words. He stepped back from the railing. And in the small, clean silence that followed, I understood the shape of what the guards were doing. They were not chasing him. They were not wrestling him to the cobbles for the cameras, which is exactly what would have rescued his video, turned him from a clown into a martyr, given him the spectacle he had come for. They were doing something far worse to a man like him. They were waiting. Calmly, lawfully, with the full, slow weight of the institution behind them, they were simply going to let the consequences arrive. The older man took out a small notebook. He looked at the cut over the guard's eye and he wrote something down. He looked at the cream on the tunic, the time, the position of the sun, and he wrote that down too. He was building a record while the vlogger built nothing but panic. "You," the older man said without looking up, and it took me a second to realize he meant me. "The baker, you sold him those." "2 custard horns," I said, my voice still shook. "He filmed himself buying them. He said he was going to test the guard." "He said that to you?" "Plain as day. There's a camera over my counter. It'll have the sound." Something moved across the older man's face. Not a smile, nothing so loose as that, but a kind of grim satisfaction, the look of a man who has just been handed the last piece of a thing he was already certain of. "Good," he said. "We'll want that." The vlogger heard. Of course he heard. He was hanging on every word now, his bravado gone to tatters. "You can't use my footage," he said quickly. "It's mine. It's my content. It's copyrighted. You can't." "It's your confession," the older man said. And that was the moment, I think, that the vlogger finally understood. I watched it cross his face like a shadow crossing a wall, the slow, sickening arrival of the truth that the very thing he had built his whole life around, the camera, always running, always capturing, never lowered, had been faithfully recording his own crime from the first throw. He had filmed himself announcing his intent. He had filmed himself committing the act. He had filmed the blood. He had narrated all of it in his own bright voice for an audience of thousands, live, with timestamps, and he could no more take it back than a man can swallow a shout. He had built a machine to capture his triumphs, and it had captured the one thing that would end him. His hand began at last to lower the phone. "Keep it up," the older man said almost gently. "You'll want to remember exactly how this went." The constables came on foot from the corner, 2 of them at a brisk walk, and a third figure with them in a plain dark suit carrying a slim case, the legal officer the older man had asked for. They did not run. Nobody on that side of the railing ever ran. It was as if hurry itself were a thing they had been trained out of, and the slowness of it was its own kind of pressure. The vlogger watched them come, and his face did a thing I had never seen a grown man's face do, a kind of crumbling at the edges, while the center fought to hold the old confident shape. "Listen, this is a misunderstanding," he started, the words tumbling now. "I'll take the video down right now. I'll delete the whole thing, you'll never see it again, no harm done, right? It's gone, it's like it never." "Don't delete anything," the legal officer said pleasantly, the first words out of her. She had a calm I recognized from the older man, the calm of people who do difficult things often and have stopped finding them difficult. Deleting evidence after you've been told it's evidence is its own offense. You'd be adding to the pile. I'd hold very still if I were you, and I'd keep your hands where the constables can see them. He held very still. The first constable stepped to the railing. "Sir, what's your name?" For a moment the vlogger said nothing, and I understood the size of the silence, because his name was his fortune. His name was on everything. His name was the brand he had spent years carving into the world, and now here it was being asked of him by a man with handcuffs on his belt, and answering it meant the brand and the man were about to become the same fragile thing. He told them, "I won't write it here. It doesn't matter anymore, which is the whole point, but it mattered enormously to him. I could see it cost him to say it aloud. You're under arrest for assault on a serving guardsman in the execution of his duty," the constable said, "and for occasioning actual bodily harm. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defense if you fail to mention, when questioned, something you later rely on in court." He recited it the way the baker down the road recites the price of bread, flat and certain and unstoppable. "You're arresting me," the vlogger's voice cracked clean up the middle. "For cream. People do this all the time. There are 100 videos. This is a thing people do. It's a genre. It's harmless. Everybody who does it is committing an assault," the legal officer said. "Most of them are simply never caught with the soldier bleeding and a signed confession narrated over the top. You were thorough. She let that sit. You did our work for us." They brought him around to the gap in the railing. He did not fight. There was nothing of the brawl in it, no drama for the lens, but he twisted his head this way and that, hunting the crowd, and what he found in their faces undid the last of him, because they were all filming, every one of them. The same wall of phones he had performed for his whole career was turned on him now, silent, recording his small, frightened face as the cuffs went on, and he understood at last that the audience he had courted so hard had no loyalty in it at all. It only ever wanted the spectacle, and now he was the spectacle. "Don't film this," he said to them, to all of them, the irony of it apparently lost on him even then. "Stop filming. You can't, you don't have permission." Nobody lowered a phone. I think that was the true sentence, the one no court would ever read out. The cuffs were cold metal and a process, but the wall of strangers turning his own weapon on him, refusing him the mercy he had refused the guard, that was the punishment that fit the crime. As they walked him toward the corner, I saw him crane back one last time toward the gate, toward the 2 guardsmen who had not moved, who stood now exactly as they had stood before he arrived, eyes forward, rifles at the shoulder, the cream wiped clean by an attendant, and the small cut already dressed with a neat strip of white. They had outlasted him. He had come to prove they were not real, that they could be made to break, and they had stood there and let the morning prove the opposite about him instead. The older man stayed a moment after the constables had gone. He looked at the first guard, the one who had worn the cream and the cut without a sound, and he said something to him too quietly for me to hear, and the guard's eyes flicked toward him for the briefest instant and then forward again, and that was all. A whole conversation in half a glance. Then the older man turned to me. "You'll need to make a statement," he said, "and we'll want that footage from your counter, today if you can. The sooner it's logged, the cleaner it is." "Of course," I said, "anything you need." "You did the right thing stepping in." He studied me with those level eyes. "Most people film, you set your tray down. I have been thanked for things in my life. None of them ever landed the way that did." "I sold him the pastries," I said. "I felt like I owed it." "You didn't sell him his choices," the older man said. "Come, show me the camera." We crossed the lane to my shop, and the crowd was already breaking up behind us, but the phones were not going dark. They were going somewhere. I understood that even then. Every one of those recordings was climbing onto the same networks the vlogger had spent his life climbing, and they were arriving faster than he could ever have dreamed for one of his own videos, because there is nothing the crowd loves more than the loud man brought low. He had taught them that appetite himself, fed it for years, and now it had turned and was feeding on him. Inside, I queued up the footage from the little camera over my counter, while the legal officer watched over my shoulder. And there he was, 4 minutes before the smear, leaning toward the glass eye of his own phone, bright and certain and pleased with himself, saying the words plain as a bell into a recording that would now be played in a room with no audience at all, except the people who decided what happened to him next. "We're gonna test him. We're gonna find out if these guys are even real." The legal officer let out a slow breath. "Well," she said, "that's the intent and the planning stated aloud 4 minutes before the act, time-stamped in his own voice, witnessed by you." She glanced at the guard's blood, still bright in her memory, I think, the way it was in mine. "He really did do all of it for us." I made my statement at the counter while the bread went cold in the racks. And outside, across the lane, the 2 guardsmen stood their post in the bright, clean morning as if nothing had happened at all, which was, I came to understand, the entire victory. By the time I closed the shop that evening, the thing had already grown teeth I could not have imagined. I am not a man who lives on his phone. I have a small one, an old one, and I keep it in a drawer most days. But my niece runs my shop's account, the little page where she posts photographs of the morning loaves, and she came in at 4 o'clock white-faced and turned her screen toward me. And there it was, the smear, the cut, the cuffs, replaying across the whole country from 1,000 angles at once. Not his angle. He had been narrating to an audience he believed was on his side. But the crowd's footage told a different story than the one he had meant to tell, and it was the crowd's footage that won. There he was leaning over the railing to push food into a still man's face. There was the second pastry, thrown hard, and the snap of the guard's head, and the thin red line. And there, over and over, slowed down and circled and pointed at, was the moment the laughter died, the moment his bright certainty curdled into fear when the older man said the word admissible. People who study these things will tell you that the crowd does not forgive cruelty to the defenseless, and it does not forgive a coward, and it positively hungers for the spectacle of a loud man learning he is neither as clever nor as untouchable as he told everyone he was. The vlogger had served that hunger to others for years. Now the table had been laid with him. His own channel went first. I learned the details over the following days, partly from my niece, partly from the legal officer who came back to take a fuller statement, partly from the ordinary churn of talk that ran up and down our lane like floodwater. The platform that had paid him, that had made him rich, that had turned his face into a fortune, suspended his account within hours. Then the suspension became a removal. The advertisers whose money flowed to him through that account read the same morning the rest of the country read, saw their names sitting next to a video of a man assaulting a bleeding soldier and calling it a joke, and they did what advertisers always do at the first whiff of smoke. They ran. Every one of them. By the second day, there was no money left to demonetize, because there was no channel left to carry it. He had built a tower out of attention, and attention, it turns out, is the one currency that can vanish overnight. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this as a story of a crowd's revenge, and that is not the story. The crowd was loud and the crowd was fickle, and the crowd would have cheered just as hard the other way if the morning had gone differently. The crowd is not justice. The crowd is just weather. The justice was quieter, and it belonged to the men at the gate. What ruined the vlogger was not the mob. It was the simple, documented, unhurried fact of what he had done, set against the simple, documented, unhurried fact of what the guard had not done. Side by side, there was no argument to be had. One man had crossed a railing to strike a soldier who had sworn not to strike back and had filmed himself planning it. The other man had stood his post and bled a little and waited for the law. You did not need to be told which was which. The contrast did all the work, and the contrast was true, and truth, when it is recorded plainly enough, does not need a mob to enforce it. It only needs to be seen. The legal section had been thorough where the vlogger had been thorough, which is to say it used his own thoroughness against him. His narrated intent from my counter camera. The crowd's 12 angles of the act. The medical note on the cut above the guard's eye. His threats to the officer, recorded in his own live stream. By the time it reached a courtroom, there was nothing left to decide except the size of the consequence, and the consequence, when it came, was real. Not a fine he could pay out of pocket and laugh off, but a conviction that would sit on his name forever, a name he had spent his whole life trying to make sure everyone knew. Now everyone knew it for exactly the wrong reason. I attended one day of it. I had to confirm my statement and play the footage from my counter, and I sat in that quiet wood-paneled room and watched a thing I will not forget. They played his own video. The whole room watched him buy 2 pastries from a baker and grin into his phone and say, "We're gonna test him. We're gonna find out if these guys are even real." And then they played the crowd's footage of the answer to his question. The guard had been real. The cream had been real. The cut had been real. And the discipline, the terrible, immovable, unglamorous discipline that had refused to give him the brawl he wanted, that had been the most real thing in the entire affair. And it was the thing that had destroyed him, because a man cannot be made a victim by a statue that will not move. The guard himself gave evidence. He stood in the box in plain clothes, which felt strange to me, like seeing a familiar building with its lights off. And he answered every question in the same flat, unhurried voice he had used to say the only 4 words he spoke on the day. Step back from the railing. He was asked why he had not defended himself. He was asked by the defense, in a tone that tried to make it sound foolish, whether he could not simply have stepped aside or wiped his face or told the man to stop. "My orders are to hold my post," the guard said. "A man at his post who throws the first punch is no longer at his post. He's just a man in a fight. I wasn't going to give him that." "You let him strike you twice." "I let him show everyone exactly who he was," the guard said. "That cost me a cut. It cost him more." The defense had no follow-up to that. There was nothing to follow it with. And the older man, the officer with the insignia at his cuff, who turned out to be the senior of the whole gate detail, was asked why he had told the vlogger to keep filming, why he had not simply confiscated the phone. His answer is the one I have repeated most often, to my niece, to my customers, to anyone who asks me about that morning. "Because the truth was on that phone," he said, "and a man who is telling the truth has no reason to fear a camera. He was the only one of us who needed to be afraid of it, so I let him keep it running. The honest don't hide from the record. Only the guilty do, and he hadn't worked that out yet. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The vlogger had spent his entire career certain that the camera was a weapon, that it gave him power over still and silent men who could not answer back. And it was a weapon. He had simply been wrong, in the deepest way a man can be wrong, about which end of it he was standing on. The weeks after were strange ones on our lane. For a while we had more visitors than we had ever had, people who came not for bread, but to stand at the east railing where it happened and look at the guards, and, I suspect, to feel something they could not quite name. A kind of relief, maybe, that there are still men who will not be moved, even when moving would be so much easier. My shop did the best business of its life off the back of the worst morning of my conscience, and I gave a good deal of it away, because it did not feel like money I had earned. The vlogger, I heard, tried for a time to claw his way back. There was an apology video, filmed in a dim room with his voice gone soft and careful, in which he called it all a lapse in judgment and asked for understanding. It did not work. The crowd that had built him could smell the calculation in it, the same calculation that had checked the camera angle before pushing food into a soldier's face, and they wanted nothing more to do with him. He had taught them too well what a real moment looked like. They could no longer be sold a fake one. The apology video sank without a ripple. After that he went quiet, the way a fire goes quiet, and the lane stopped talking about him, which was the last and worst thing that could happen to a man who had needed so badly to be talked about. I do not take satisfaction in that. I want to be honest about it. A man's whole life coming apart is not a pleasant thing to watch, even when the man brought it on himself, and there were nights I lay awake turning the custard horns over in my mind, wondering whether a braver baker would have refused to sell them. But I have made my peace with it. He did not need me to sell him the pastries. He had 2 more in his other pocket. The legal officer told me that later, almost as an afterthought. He had come loaded for the bit. If it had not been my counter, it would have been the next one down the lane. The choice was always his, all the way down to the underhand throw that split a soldier's brow. The guard came into my shop once, about a month after. I did not recognize him at first, out of the tunic, in an ordinary coat with an ordinary scarf, just a tall, quiet man buying a loaf at the end of the day. It was the stillness that gave him away. He stood at my counter with the same settled weight he carried at the railing, and when I finally placed him, my hands went unsteady all over again and I could not make change. "You're him," I said stupidly. "And you're the baker who set down his tray," he said. There was the smallest dry warmth in it, the first I had ever heard from him. I asked him how the cut had healed. He touched the spot above his eye, where there was now only the faintest pale line, and said it was nothing, that he'd had worse from a low door. I asked him because I had to, because it had been sitting in me for a month, how he had stood there and taken it. How any man could. He thought about it the way he seemed to think about everything, without hurry. "You think the hard part is not hitting back," he said. "It isn't. Anyone can be still for a second. The hard part is believing while it's happening that being still is going to win. He needed me to lose faith in it. That was the whole game. If I'd swung at him, he'd have had his video, bleeding's nothing but a guardsman throwing a punch. That's a career, that's a headline. He wanted me to trade my discipline for his entertainment." He picked up his loaf. "I just had to want to keep my discipline more than he wanted to take it. Turns out I did." "And if you'd been wrong?" I said, "If it hadn't won." "Then it still wouldn't have been him who beat me," he said. "It would have been me. The discipline was never about him, he just found out what it was made of." He laid the money on the counter exact and turned to go, and at the door he paused. "Thank you for the camera footage, and for the bread." A breath of that dry warmth again. "The whole gate's been eating your rolls for a month. Sergeant buys them by the dozen." Then he was gone, back out into the lane and across to the railing where, the next morning at his hour, he would stand his post again exactly as he had before any of it happened, unchanged, unbroken, eyes forward on the far thing the rest of us cannot see. That is the part that stays with me. Not the cream or the cuffs or the channel falling to nothing in a single day. It is that the man who tried to break him is gone now, scrubbed off the very platform he thought made him untouchable, his name a thing he winces to hear, and the man he tried to break is still standing at the east gate this morning in the same spot, holding the same line, as if to say to anyone who passes, "You can throw what you like. The post remains. I remain." I bake bread across the lane from him, and most mornings I carry a roll out to the sergeant at the relief, and I think about how loud the one man was and how silent the other, and which of the two the world finally chose to keep. The loud man wanted to find out if the guard was real. He found out. He just never understood that the answer was the thing that ended him, that the realest man on that whole bright street was the one who never said a word, never raised a hand, and never for 1 second gave him what he came for. That is what discipline is, I think, in the end. Not the absence of feeling, the refusal to spend it cheaply. The guard kept his and kept his post and kept his name clean while a louder man lost all three in an afternoon. I have stopped lying awake about the pastries. Some mornings the line at my counter is long, and across the lane the tall still figure stands his hour in the early light, and I think the lane is exactly as it should be. The baker baking, the guard guarding, and the loud men learning, one at a time, that there is something in this world that will not move for them no matter how hard they push, and that it was never weakness. It was the strongest thing on the street, and it was standing there in plain sight the whole time, waiting for them to throw the first punch and finish themselves.